I just wanted to explain my recent conversion to Fall and Marky Smith. And for people who are Fall fans, I know that this will be no news to any of them. But if you've never heard The Fall or you've never come across Marky Smith, I would urge you to do so. Once you fall down the rabbit hole of The Fall, it's really impossible to unsee the beauty, art, and um, raison d'etre of what it's all about. um, the best way I can describe it is that once you get The Fall, you can't see any other musicians in the same way again, and this is really something that's eye-opening. Everything else looks fake and performative and cliche and careerist when you compare the output of The Fall and the way they operated and the approach to making music and so on and so forth. And the difference between The Fall, or one of the differences, there's many differences, but one of the differences with The Fall and other groups, and Marky Smith always called The Fall a group rather than a band, for various reasons. Um, there's a brilliant book by Steve Hanley called The Big Midweek, which I would urge you to buy. I'll put a link in the description below. And there's another good book by Simon Wollstonecraft of The Fall. You can drum, but you can't hide. That's another cracking book. And I think Brix Smith has also done a book as well, which includes a lot of her time about her time in The Fall, arriving in Manchester, and so on and so forth, and the culture shock from LA to Manchester in the early 80s is really worth reading. So, to get back on track, the Fall is genuine, authentic, and it means it. You know, if there was anything called punk rock, what I've now learned is the punk rock attitude actually it was packaged, and I mean, there's no great debate about the Sex Pistols and the packaging of the Sex Pistols and the management by Malcolm McLaren and you know, the, the, the great rock and roll swindle and all the rest of that stuff. And John Lydon now, he's still performing even a few weeks ago on a tour, and his approach to doing that and so on is it's still in stark contrast to Marky Smith and the way that he fulfilled the work of The Fall, of which it's huge. The body of work The Fall did is incredible and unbelievable, and they reached so many musicians and therefore their families and network just within one group itself. I think there were 63 members that came and went in The Fall, 32 studio albums, loads and dozens of compilations of live music that's been recorded and put out there by various people of various qualities. And indeed, some of the members are still going now. Some of the ex-members are still musicians, thankfully. And there's a group called House of All, which comprises various characters from the history of The Fall, important people who played a really important role in the band, still going to this day. So check those out on YouTube or Spotify. They've got some great music. I think what's prompted this video is I've always loved Manchester music. I'm from Manchester, and I thought I knew everything about the history of Manchester music. And there's been loads of books written about it, which I've got. My bookshelf is, you can't see my bookshelf here, but it's full of music books and novels, biographies rather, about the Manchester music scene and stuff around it. And I thought I'd seen every photo and every anecdote you could possibly get about the Happy Mondays or Joy Division or the Stone Roses in particular. I've got warmth for the Stone Roses in particular because I grew up in the same area that John Squire and Ian Brown grew up in. And In fact, I went to the same school as them, but they were obviously a previous generation to me. So I have a massive affinity with the Stone Roses, and I love the Stone Roses. I love everything about them, the sound, the music, the way they look, everything. Every word they've uttered as a group, I've consumed and I know about. I've been to book launches by Dave Simpson, John Robb, Mick Middles, anybody who's written a book about the Stone Roses. I've been there. I've got signed memorabilia. I've got tickets. I've been to see them loads of times down the years. But Marky Smith was in an interview, and he said, so the interview said, "Do you like the Stone Roses?" And he said, "Oh, they're all right. They're nice lads, but they're a show band, aren't they?" And that was the end of the conversation about the Stone Roses. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I didn't really. It did not hit me like a ton of bricks. That's a lie. I just sort of shrugged it off and thought, what does he mean by that? And then when I started to watch a bit more about the Fall and learn about the history of the Fall and learn about Marky Smith, it suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks what he meant. It feels like the whole Manchester music scene is contrived. And people said this at the time. I'm not new to saying this. Factory records, the way everything was packaged and produced and aesthetically presented, and the myth making that went on, particularly by Tony Wilson, rest in peace. I'm starting to understand what people mean by the fact it was contrived. And there's nothing wrong with art being curated or commercialized. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. But it was very. There was definitely a veneer of commercialism with the whole Manchester music scene, and I'm particularly talking about the second half or the third bit of Manchester, because some people, Marky Smith said, his Manchester scene is the Hollies, which is 1960s scene. But the Manchester scene I'm talking about is the late 80s, early 90s. And there's nothing that highlights the commercialisation of Manchester more than the recent Oasis tour back together. I saw Oasis in '94, December 1994, 18th of December, in fact. Brilliant concert, brilliant gig. Loved it, right at the front. Amazing experience. But 30 years later, I never went to the reunion because it just felt packaged and sold as a business opportunity. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that's anything bad. And it was something that I didn't want to contribute to that, really. The mythology, and I also felt the Stone Roses should have been as big as that on their reunion tour as well. I think they sort of laid the ground for Oasis a little bit, and perhaps Oasis looked at what the Stone Roses did and learned from that, and were able to commercialise it to make $100 million each. Whereas the Stone Roses, I don't think they made anywhere near that on their reunion tours and stuff. But the hacienda and the fetishization of the hacienda and the tie-ups with the warehouse project and stuff like this, and hacienda classical, and I've been to that sort of stuff, but it does feel like, do you know what? It was 50 years ago when the Sex Pistols played Free Trade Hall. Why are we still banging on about it now in Manchester? And why does it cast such a long shadow? Why is it so commercialised? And the Fall, to get back to the point, were never a part of any of that. I mean, yeah, they did play from the 1976, and I guess Marky Smith and perhaps others as well. Sorry, Steve Hanley went to Free Trade Hall gigs, one of them at least. I don't know, maybe to see the Buzzcocks, perhaps. I don't know. But they were never a part of it, and they definitely define themselves as distinct from being part of it. Not just the way they spoke and sang and made music, but the way they behaved and the way they interacted. Marky Smith went to go and live in Edinburgh for 2 years at the peak of Manchester in 1990, early 1990s. So he was just destined to get away from the whole Manchester scene. So now I realise that Marky Smith was on the right track, really, in terms of art. So if your objective as a musician is to have a career, then that's the opposite of what Marky Smith stood for. And I can understand my members of the Fall. It was not easy being in the Fall, and the various books about the group will um, talk about those times and issues they had, and not least because it's a very insecure way of life and music anyway. But to be in the Fall was probably the most insecure and chaotic kind of lifestyle you can have, especially if you've got a family and you've got a partner perhaps who's nagging you to get some stability, but you believe in something and you are good at something and you're sort of stuck in something, and you're being paid to do something well, which is what all the Fall members will say. They'll say that even during the fallow years, I think they were paid, etc., etc. And they weren't paid millions, of course they weren't, but for them, it was a job, just like any other job. Nobody was giving Marky Smith millions and millions of pounds. They should have done. They should have given them millions, but they just didn't operate like that, and they weren't seen as a band to invest in on that sort of scale. Um, and opportunities that came along were scuppered, for various reasons or another, um, to get the mansion in Cheshire, etc., etc. But I don't think he ever wanted it. And something I think Paul Hanley said was that, as long as he had a nice suit and a pair of brogues and a packet of fags, Marky Smith was happy. And that wasn't contrived because he actually lived like that. So he died in 2016, Marky Smith, rest in peace. And the reason he was in the news this year was because obviously his will and probate, etc., was opened up as a matter of public record. It can take a while for public figures, the will and stuff like that, and who gets what assets to be publicly available. You know, the ownership of creative assets and intellectual property can complex things a bit more for musicians than it can for the likes of you and I. Um, and the subsequent distribution of royalties to his estate, etc., and various people had to be resolved, I guess. But what was clear was there wasn't £17 million sitting there ready to distribute to members of the estate. And it wasn't like he spent it all on fast cars and big houses. Lived in Prestwich all his life, pretty much in a flat at first, but in a couple of flats that he had in Prestwich, and then a semi-detached house, um, which was pretty normal, to be honest. Just thought I'd have a bit of brew there. So I've discovered the Fall, and where do you start with the Fall? And a few friends of mine have already said to me, "Oh my God, the Fall! Why didn't they ever make it? What songs can you recommend for me to listen to?" And you will know if you're a Fall fan, it's very difficult to recommend any songs because there's so many gems and they're so diverse. And one or two songs doesn't represent the body of work. That's the problem. So it's really hard if somebody ever says, "What Fall song would you recommend?" But I saw an interview with Simon Wollstonecraft, who was one of the drummers, a long-standing drummer in the Fall, and also a friend of. He was in the Patrol actually, early band of the early version of the Stone Roses with John Squire and Ian Brown. And he said, start with Hit the North. So I did do that. My friend said, what would I recommend? And I sent them Hit the North. I sent them the video of Hit the North, which went down an absolute storm, actually. I was expecting people to say, oh, I hate it. But no, everybody liked it out of, the dozen friends that I have on WhatsApp in a certain group. They're the ones that I shared it with, the guys I was out with on Saturday night. So Hit the North is the one to start with if you're a Fall newbie. And then there's various other things. I personally love the mixer, the live version on VH1. For some reason, I just find it incredible. I've listened to it dozens of times. I think it's better than the studio version of it. But everybody has their own favourite Fall song. So to the Fall and the members of the Fall, thank you very much. Rest in peace, Marky Smith. Rest in peace, other members of the Fall and other influential people. Kay Carroll, for example, who passed away recently, was very influential early on in Fall. And I know there's been various people connected to the band who've help the band, support the band who aren't with us anymore. So rest in peace, all those people. Big up to the House of All. Big up to um, Fall fans, and yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to more of it over the next few weeks and months and years, hopefully.